History remembers kings for their conquests, their crowns, and their monuments, but some were remembered for something far darker. In the cold corridors of a medieval castle, one ruler turned vengeance into a religion, cruelty into policy, and blood into legacy. This is not a tale of legend, nor a ghost story. It is the true descent of a real man, King Charles of Navarre, whose hunger for retribution transformed him into the very monster he once swore to destroy. In the winter of 1332, a child was born beneath the shadow of insult. Charles of Navarre entered a world already poisoned by humiliation. His mother, Joan of Navarre, had been mocked and sidelined at the French court. Her royal blood deemed too impure, her dignity stripped before nobles who smiled while whispering. For the boy who watched, humiliation was not a lesson in humility. It was the first cut of a lifelong wound. The 14th century was a time when kingdoms were fragile, and oaths were tools of deceit. France, staggering under the weight of wars and debts, treated the smaller kingdom of Navarre as a puppet state, useful, disposable, forgettable. But within the Navarrese court, a young prince grew with quiet fury. Charles listened to tales of his mother's shame, of the Valois arrogance, and of how French power had turned his lineage into a mockery. By adolescence, he had already learned that vengeance was the only currency of respect. His tutors taught him philosophy, but his mother taught him resentment, and resentment, in his eyes, was wisdom. He studied not only letters and laws, but poisons, alliances, and manipulation. When his father died, leaving him the crown at 17, he stood at the altar of power not with reverence, but with calculation. The coronation itself was subdued. Chroniclers later described him as unusually composed, neither joyous nor solemn, but coldly aware. His first decree was not of faith or prosperity, but of loyalty. Every noble in Navarre was to swear allegiance directly to him, not to the French crown. Those who hesitated found their estates quietly confiscated. Those who obeyed learned fear would be the new foundation of obedience. France watched him with suspicion. They called him Charles le Mauvais, the bad, long before he earned the title. To them, he was unpredictable, cunning, dangerously proud. Yet to his own court, he was simply the embodiment of survival in an age when mercy was weakness. But vengeance, once kindled, consumes more than enemies. It consumes purpose. Charles's first years as king were marked not by governance, but by revenge against slights, real or imagined. Ambassadors who insulted him found their wine laced with bitter aftertastes. Courtiers who gossiped disappeared between one feast and the next. He turned humiliation into ritual. On the anniversary of his mother's death, he ordered that no French envoy be permitted to enter his castle without kneeling, a silent echo of how she had once been forced to kneel before the French queen. And yet, beneath the ruthless commands and polished cruelty, there existed something even darker, a growing emptiness. The boy who had been wronged now ruled as a man without restraint. His throne was not a seat of justice, but a monument to personal pain. By his mid-20s, Charles's eyes had grown colder, his smile sharper. Those who met him often remarked that he spoke softly, almost kindly, even when ordering a man's execution. His gentleness was the final cruelty. The crown of Navarre no longer gleamed with gold. It burned with resentment, heavy upon the head of a king who could no longer distinguish vengeance from destiny. And in the silence of his private chambers, as tapestries whispered in the candlelight, Charles would sometimes whisper to himself the same vow he had made as a boy. France will kneel before me, or I will see the world burn trying. The path was set. The monster had not yet shown his face, but the man who would become him was already born. The court of Navarre gleamed like a jewel on the outside, its marble halls scented with rose oil, its walls draped in imported velvet. Yet beneath the perfume of civility, rot festered. When King Charles the Bad ascended fully into power, he transformed his castle into a theater of fear. Every guest, Every servant, every whispered word became a move in his grand design of vengeance. He invited noblemen from France and Aragon to his feasts, offering them goblets of Burgundy wine and the promise of friendship. His voice was calm, his charm magnetic, but behind that composure lay a quiet obsession with control. Charles had learned that the surest way to kill an enemy was not on the battlefield, but at the dining table. The court physicians spoke often of the strange requests the king made: tinctures of rare herbs, venoms extracted from toads, powders from crushed stones. They were told these were for experiments in medicine. But in the king's private chambers, those same mixtures were tested on condemned prisoners. He observed the effects with clinical detachment, noting how quickly the body convulsed, how long the eyes stayed open after breath had gone. When one batch proved too slow, he simply smiled and said, "We must perfect the art of silence." By day, he played the role of diplomat. He exchanged letters with King John II of France, weaving alliances of deceit. By night, his torchlit feasts blurred into rituals of cruelty disguised as celebration. A visiting count once remarked that he felt honored by the king's attention, only to fall dead within an hour of the meal, his lips darkened by an unseen toxin. Charles called it divine irony. The Lord chooses his moments, and I am merely his hand. Queen Joan, his wife, witnessed these horrors in suffocating quiet. She sat beside him during every banquet, her face a mask of obedience, her hands trembling beneath the tablecloth. She had once believed that marriage might temper his fury, that compassion could survive beside ambition. But what she saw each night broke that hope into shards. Once, after a feast that left 3 courtiers dead and 1 blind, she dared to ask, "How can you sleep after so much suffering?" He turned to her, his expression gentle, and said, "Because I suffer most of all, my queen." Theirs is only a reflection. That night, she realized her husband's cruelty was not random, it was philosophy. He believed pain revealed truth, and loyalty could only exist when bought with fear. Outside the castle walls, rumors grew. Peasants whispered that their king had a silver tongue and a black heart. Traveling merchants refused to eat or drink when summoned to court. Even the priests who performed mass within the palace chapel crossed themselves before entering the royal hall. And yet, the French crown still entertained his diplomacy, for fear was as valuable as loyalty in those days. Charles understood this balance better than anyone. Each death, each disappearance, each poisoned chalice strengthened his legend as a man not to be crossed. The castle glowed with candlelight, but the air smelled faintly of iron, the scent of blood long scrubbed but never forgotten. Servants whispered of a cupboard where silver goblets were kept, each marked discreetly with a scratch beneath the rim. No one dared to polish them. No one dared to ask why. By the year's end, 12 nobles had died mysteriously across Navarre and France. None could prove the king's hand, but all felt his shadow. In the heart of Pamplona, among the laughter and music of his royal banquets, the king had built not a court, but a laboratory of terror. And the poison had only just begun to flow. Beneath the marble floors of Charles's castle, under the weight of sacred stone and silence, there existed a place that was never marked on royal maps. It was said to lie below the chapel, a crypt converted into something unspeakable. There, behind iron doors and dripping walls, King Charles the Bad built the chamber where truth was extracted not by confession, but by agony. It began under the guise of necessity. The kingdom was unstable, whispers of rebellion stirred through Navarre, and spies of France roamed the countryside. Charles, paranoid and methodical, declared that treachery could no longer be judged by words alone. Men will lie to save their souls, he told his council, but the body cannot. So the dungeon was constructed. Its design came not from any architect, but from the king himself. Chains embedded in stone. A ceiling low enough that a man could never stand upright. A drainage channel carved discreetly toward the river below. to carry away what was left after questioning. At first, few believed the rumors. The king had built chapels, commissioned music, and offered donations to monasteries. How could such a man harbor a torture house beneath the house of God? Yet at night, the truth leaked through the cracks. Muffled screams carried faintly through the chapel floor, like the weeping of ghosts. The priests who prayed above learned to raise their voices during Mass, drowning the sound with hymns. Charles called his victims instruments of revelation. Many were not enemies at all: a merchant who failed to deliver gold on time, a servant accused of eavesdropping, a soldier who had once mocked him in drunken jest. The interrogations were rarely about information. They were performances, a ritual where the king played both priest and executioner of his own justice. He often attended them himself. Witnesses described his manner as disturbingly calm. He would stand in the shadows, hands clasped, listening to the crack of bone and the hiss of heated iron with an expression of contemplation, as if studying human anatomy rather than cruelty. When a prisoner confessed, truthfully or not, he would simply nod and whisper, "There is purity in pain. You may go to God cleansed." The guards who worked there aged rapidly. Some drank until their hands shook too violently to hold the keys. Others disappeared altogether, their families left to assume they had fled. One chronicler later wrote that the king's dungeon devoured men twice, once in the body and once in the soul. Outside, the people of Navarre began to speak of a curse over the castle. Livestock refused to graze near the foundations. Servants claimed the stones bled when washed. The church grew uneasy, but no bishop dared confront the king. His power was too absolute, his wrath too precise. Charles still prayed daily in the chapel above, kneeling over the same stones that concealed his secret chamber. His lips moved in perfect rhythm, his voice calm, his expression serene. To the priests, it was piety. To those who knew the truth, it was mockery. Over time, the chamber beneath the stone became more than a prison. It was the mirror of Charles's mind, cold, meticulous, and echoing with the sounds of his own corruption. Each screen below was a whisper of the man he used to be, fading deeper into the dark. And though no records remain of how many died there, one truth endures in every chronicle that dared mention it. When Charles prayed for forgiveness, he did so above the very place where his soul was already buried. The courtiers called her La Douce Reine, the gentle queen. But behind the title, Queen Joan of Navarre lived a life of quiet terror. Her husband, King Charles the Bad, had mastered the art of appearing human in public. In private, he was something colder, not mad but perfectly sane in his cruelty. Joan understood this truth too well. She had learned that his affection was a performance, his tenderness a blade wrapped in silk. Her letters to the French court, written in coded phrases and trembling Latin, reveal the decay of her spirit. In one, she wrote, "The castle grows darker even when the candles are lit. I no longer pray for mercy, only for silence." Each day, she walked through halls heavy with whispers. Servants avoided her gaze, afraid that kindness toward her might be misread as conspiracy. Even her ladies-in-waiting spoke in half-breaths, for the king's spies walked barefoot through the corridors, listening behind every curtain. Joan's world became smaller: a few chambers, a locked library, and her garden, where she was allowed to breathe the air under watch. Yet her heart had not hardened entirely. She could not ignore the suffering that surrounded her. One winter night, a maid named Therese was dragged before the king, accused of stealing a gold clasp. Joan knew the girl, young, frightened, innocent. She also knew that Charles's punishments rarely fit the crime. That night, after the interrogation, the queen bribed a guard to leave the gate unlocked. Therese escaped under the cover of snow, fleeing into the mountains. It was a small act of mercy, and it would be her undoing. By dawn, the escape was discovered. The guard was found hanging by his wrists in the courtyard, his eyes plucked out. The king summoned the queen to his chamber, where a single candle burned beside an open ledger. He did not shout. He did not strike her. He merely gestured for her to sit. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost kind. "You helped her," he said. "You, of all people, should know what mercy breeds." She tried to speak, but no words came. He smiled faintly, closing the ledger. "I will not punish you, Joan. Punishment is for the guilty. You, my dear, have simply forgotten who rules this house." For weeks afterward, the castle fell eerily silent. The queen was confined to her chambers, her correspondence cut off. Those who served her were dismissed, replaced by strangers loyal only to the king. Even the garden, her last refuge, was locked. When she was finally seen again in a public mass, she looked pale and hollow, her eyes unfocused. Chroniclers wrote that she spoke only in whispers, often pausing mid-sentence as if listening for something unseen. Some said the king had broken her spirit. Others said he had taken something more, the will to resist. Charles continued to host his glittering feasts and forge political alliances, but those who looked closely saw that the queen no longer stood beside him. Her seat remained empty, her voice absent. And in the quiet corners of the castle, the servants began to say that kindness itself had died, buried with the maid who had fled into the mountains, and with the queen who had tried to save her. For Charles, mercy had always been a form of weakness. For Joan, it had become a form of martyrdom. The king had silenced her, not with death, but with fear so deep it erased her from her own life. The court of Navarre glittered that night like a serpent in candlelight. King Charles had declared a feast, a grand celebration marking the peace between Navarre and France, a treaty few believed and fewer dared to question. The great hall was transformed into a theater of splendor. Gold chandeliers swayed above crimson banners, and the scent of roasted boar mingled with incense and deceit. French envoys arrived in silks and suspicion. They were greeted by the king's polished smile, the same smile that had preceded so many executions. To the untrained eye, it was diplomacy. To those who knew him, it was the prelude to something else. The queen was absent, still confined to her chambers. Yet her shadow lingered in every corner. Charles had not spoken her name in weeks, but he carried her silence like a trophy. As goblets filled and laughter swelled, the king raised his cup. "To peace," he proclaimed. "To friendship between crowns." The guests echoed his toast, unaware that every servant had been carefully placed, every drink poured with deliberate precision. At the center of the long oak table sat the French ambassador, a man too proud, too certain that reason could tame a tyrant. Before him gleamed a cup of dark wine, rich and red as blood. Charles leaned forward, his tone conspiratorial. "Tell me, my friend," he said, "do you trust a man's word more when it comes from his mouth or from his hand?" The ambassador smiled. "From both, if the man is a king." The hall laughed. Only the servants did not. Then came the moment, a whisper, a shift, a servant's trembling hand as he switched the goblets, perhaps too nervously, perhaps too soon. The ambassador's cup passed to another guest, the king's cousin, Louis of Evreux, a man young enough to still believe in honor. The king lifted his glass. The room fell into a rhythm of sound, clinking, drinking, relief. And then, silence. Louis coughed once, then again. His hand clutched at his throat as his face darkened to violet. The laughter died. Wine spilled. Someone screamed. He collapsed across the table, the goblet rolling from his fingers. Foam bubbled from his lips. Within moments, he was still. The king rose slowly, watching with an expression too calm to be grief. The French ambassador froze, realizing the truth. The poison had been meant for him. A murmur spread like fire. Accusations, prayers, terror. The king's guards surrounded the hall, blades drawn. No one was permitted to leave. The feast had become a trap, a stage for paranoia and death. Charles did not shout. He simply looked around the table, his voice cutting through the panic. "One of you betrayed my blood. Find the guilty, or I shall feast on all your tongues." By dawn, the chandeliers had gone dark. The hall reeked of smoke and vomit. The French envoys were detained, interrogated, stripped of their dignity. The cooks and servants were whipped, their silence mistaken for guilt. But the truth was simpler and far more horrifying. The king himself had caused it. Some said he intended to test loyalty, to see who would tremble first. Others whispered that he had planned the assassination but misjudged fate's cruelty. The next day, he ordered Louis's body displayed in the courtyard, a warning to traitors unseen. He watched from his balcony as crows descended on the corpse, his face expressionless. That night, the courtiers heard him laughing, a deep, uneven laugh that did not sound human. The Feast of Blood became legend. It marked the moment when Charles the Bad's mask began to crack, when power turned inward and madness found its throne. The king who once played at cruelty now began to live it. By the winter of 1361, whispers of rebellion crept through the corridors of Navarre's castles like draughts of cold air. The Feast of Blood had not only poisoned a man, it had poisoned faith itself. Every noble, every priest, every servant now measured their words, as if each syllable could summon the king's wrath. Among those who no longer bowed with conviction was Charles's own brother, Philip of Navarre. Once his loyal confidant, Philip had grown hollow-eyed, worn down by the endless executions, the disappearances, and the soft sound of the queen's weeping echoing behind closed doors. He began to meet in secret with priests and minor nobles, men who still dared to whisper of a different Navarre, a kingdom ruled by reason rather than fear. In these clandestine meetings, they spoke not of open war, but of quiet deliverance. The plan was simple: seize the royal treasury, imprison the king in his hunting lodge at Estella, and demand abdication. They prayed that blood need not be spilled. But in Charles's kingdom, even prayers were dangerous. The plot lasted barely a fortnight before it reached the ears of the king's spymaster, a mute eunuch named Esteban, whose loyalty was not born of affection but of terror. By dawn, the conspirators were taken, dragged from their beds in iron chains. Philip was not among them. He had fled the capital under cover of night. Charles's fury was not loud. It was methodical. He ordered that the captured conspirators be stripped naked and flayed alive before the castle walls. The punishment, he said, must teach the value of loyalty to those who still possess skin. The executioners worked in the morning sun, the air thick with salt and flies. The screams rose across the valley, carried by the wind to the villages below. Mothers covered their children's ears. Priests shut the church doors. Yet no one dared pray aloud. When the work was done, the king ordered the bodies hung upside down from iron hooks, their peeled flesh glistening like wax. A wooden sign beneath them read simply, "For the crime of silence." That night, Charles walked alone among the corpses, the torchlight casting monstrous shadows across his face. He spoke softly, as if addressing them. "You were my brother's men. Now you belong to me." Far away, Philip watched the smoke from the capital rising against the horizon. His rebellion had failed before it had begun. Yet guilt tormented him more than fear. He knew that his brother's cruelty had no end, not even for blood. In the days that followed, Charles summoned his council. When one minister dared suggest pardoning Philip, the king replied, "Mercy is the child of weakness." He ordered that every priest known to have met with Philip be blinded, their eyes a gift to heaven, for they saw too much. The executions continued until even the guards grew pale. The castle became a graveyard in motion. Every sound of footsteps could be the prelude to punishment. The queen remained silent, watching from behind her barred window. Her last surviving lady-in-waiting wrote later that the queen prayed not for deliverance, but for his death. By spring, Charles stood utterly alone. His courtiers obeyed, but without soul. His army followed, but without faith. Even his reflection seemed to mock him, a crown balanced on the bones of a man who had devoured his own bloodline. The brothers' revolt had not toppled the king, but it had destroyed something deeper, the illusion that he ruled by divine right. What remained was only fear. And in the dark corridors of Navarre, fear had begun to whisper back. The year was 1363 when the Black Death returned to Navarre. The first bodies appeared in the markets: a merchant's apprentice, a beggar woman, a soldier's child. Within weeks, the air itself felt diseased, heavy with the scent of rot and fear. Villages emptied overnight, and even the wind carried whispers of doom. But while most rulers prayed for deliverance, Charles of Navarre saw only opportunity. To him, pestilence was not a curse but a cleansing, a fire sent by God to burn away disloyalty. He called it divine purification. "Let the plague choose the guilty," he declared from his marble balcony, his voice echoing over the frightened crowd below. "And I shall finish what God begins." His command was swift and merciless. Villages reporting sickness were surrounded by soldiers and torched to ash men, women, and children locked inside their homes as the flames devoured them. The smoke rose like black banners against the pale sky, and the king watched from afar, a goblet of wine in hand. Yet not all bowed to his blasphemy. Among the few who dared speak against him was Father Rodrigo, an aged priest from Pamplona. Thin, frail, yet fearless, Rodrigo rode to the castle gates alone, demanding an audience. The guards, shaken by his resolve, allowed him through. When he entered the throne hall, the king was dining alone, a silver plate before him, a knife gleaming beside roasted meat. "Your Majesty," the priest said, bowing, "the plague is not sent for us to destroy one another. Mercy, not fire, purifies the soul." Charles looked up, eyes glinting. "Mercy?" he said softly, slicing a piece of meat. "Mercy is what sick men beg for before dying." Rodrigo stepped closer. "You were anointed by God, not by vengeance. If you burn his children, you burn your own salvation." The king's knife paused. For a moment, there was silence. Then Charles rose, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps," he murmured, "you are right, Father. Perhaps I have been too harsh." The priest exhaled, relieved, but too soon. Charles turned to his guards. "Take this holy man," he said, "and show him what it means to be one with the plague he loves so dearly." The next day, under a gray dawn, Father Rodrigo was brought to the courtyard. Before him lay a heap of corpses, swollen and blackened. The stench was unbearable. The king stood nearby, wrapped in his fur cloak, smiling faintly. "Stitch him to his congregation," Charles ordered. "Let his faith keep him warm." The guards hesitated. The king's voice hardened. "Do it." And so they did. The priest was sewn into the belly of a plague corpse, a grotesque union of flesh and decay. When the final stitch was tied, his muffled prayers could still be heard. Charles commanded that the body be buried alive at the base of the chapel hill, beneath a stone that read, "Here lies mercy." By that evening, the bells of the chapel rang endlessly, not for mourning, but for fear. The people began to whisper that the king himself was cursed, that the priest's dying prayer had reached heaven. And perhaps it had. For soon after, the sickness reached the castle itself. Servants fell ill, their bodies blistering. Even Charles's physicians began to flee. The king ordered the gates sealed, but no wall could keep death from creeping in. In the silence of his darkened hall, Charles of Navarre sat alone, surrounded by smoke, corpses, and the faint echo of a priest's last words. Mercy purifies the soul. But mercy no longer lived within the walls of Navarre. only the echo of divine punishment, and the king who mistook it for power. By 1364, the years of poison, vengeance, and relentless cruelty had begun to turn inward. Charles of Navarre, once sharp-eyed and commanding, now faced a body that betrayed him at every step. The same hands that had orchestrated executions and feasts of death were now racked with trembling. The king's skin burned with sores that spread like wildfire across his chest and limbs. Physicians, long accustomed to fear as much as medicine, refused to touch him. Those brave enough were terrified of his temper, but even more so of his affliction. They wrapped him in linen soaked in alcohol, murmuring prayers as they bound the sheets against the rot that festered beneath his flesh. Purification, they called it, though none dared say aloud that the king was dying by his own design. Charles, ever conscious of appearances, continued to hold court from his bed, reclining beneath piles of velvet and gold cushions. He issued decrees, listened to envoys, and administered punishments, all with the same cold precision as before. Only now, his voice had an edge of rasp, his movements were slow, and each command seemed to take more effort than the last. He had long believed that power was eternal, that fear could stave off time and decay. But as the infection crept into his bones, he realized that even the throne offered no escape. Every scream he had orchestrated haunted him, a chorus of the condemned, whispering in the marrow of his own body. One evening, as the castle slept under a crescent moon, a servant approached the king's chamber with a lit candle, unaware of the precarious flammability of the alcohol-soaked linens. A single misstep, a spark, and the chamber erupted into instant horror. Flames licked at the king's body. He screamed, a sound that had no precedent even in the cruelest halls of his castle. He thrashed against the bindings, tearing at linen and flesh, his skin blistering, peeling, igniting into black smoke. Servants rushed in, but no one dared approach. They threw blankets, poured water, and shouted, yet the fire had claimed him entirely. In those final moments, Charles of Navarre's face was said to be both terrified and incredulous, as though he could not comprehend that vengeance, which had once been a tool, was now a force returned upon him. The screams that had echoed in his hall for decades now came from him alone, burning through the night like a final sermon. The flames consumed everything. Gold melted, tapestries charred, the scent of singed flesh mingled with smoke. When morning came, the king's body was unrecognizable, a pile of ashes and scorched bone where a man had once ruled through fear. In the castle, the walls themselves seemed to shudder with the memory of centuries of cruelty. The courtyard, where rebels had been flayed, lay silent. The hidden dungeons, where prisoners had screamed for mercy, no longer echoed with life. Even the candles that had once illuminated deceit now burned weakly, flickering over charred wood and soot-stained stone. No man had delivered justice to Charles. No armies had stormed the castle. No rival crowns had struck him down. The fire, accidental, ironic, inevitable, had done what the world could not. It claimed the king in a moment as violent and unstoppable as his own reign. And as the smoke cleared, the survivors of his court whispered among themselves, realizing that the tyranny that had loomed over Navarre for decades had ended not by sword, but by fate's silent, unforgiving hand. The king who had once ruled with fear had been undone by fire. When the flames of Charles of Navarre's chamber died, the castle fell into a stillness that was almost unnatural. Smoke curled through the stone corridors, lingering in corners where shadows had once whispered of betrayal. Servants fled in terror, abandoning kitchens, stables, and guard posts. The gates were left open, and the streets of Pamplona felt empty, as though the heartbeat of the kingdom had been extinguished with its ruler. Queen Joan's chambers remained locked. Chroniclers later described the lingering stench that clung to the palace for weeks, a stench not only of fire and ash, but of decay, fear, and the echoes of decades of cruelty. No one dared enter the private rooms of the queen, whose own life had become a testament to silent suffering. She emerged finally, pale and quiet, walking among the ruins of a court that had demanded obedience without question. Outside, the city breathed cautiously. Merchants whispered of the king's death in hushed tones, speaking of the fire that had claimed him as though it were a divine judgment. Nobles, once poised to curry favor with him, now avoided each other, afraid of retaliation even after the tyrant's end. In those empty streets, fear lingered like a ghost. The castle, for all its stones and banners, now seemed hollow. Courtyards that had seen flayings and executions were silent. Tapestries that had once depicted victories and feasts now hung in blackened gloom, their colors dulled by smoke. The hidden dungeons beneath the chapel remained closed, their secrets buried, though tales of the tortured and the dead continued to circulate in whispered retellings. The walls themselves seemed to remember the screams. In the aftermath, Navarre's nobles moved cautiously to restore order, but the king's legacy persisted. Charles's reign had been one of absolute fear, and fear had left marks deeper than any sword or fire. Loyalty had been bought with terror, and rebellion had been punished with horror, leaving a kingdom in which obedience was still measured by silence. Queen Joan lived on, her body aging, her spirit heavy with the memory of decades beside a monster. She never remarried, never spoke of her husband except in letters to France, which chroniclers preserved for their cautionary value. In them, she described a man born of humiliation who had spent his life perfecting cruelty as an art form. He ruled as a shadow, she wrote, and left the living to wonder if they were still in the light. Charles's dynasty did not survive him. Without an heir strong enough to command loyalty, Navarre's throne fractured, and neighboring kingdoms moved quickly to assert influence. Yet even as borders shifted and politics evolved, the scar of Charles the Bad remained, etched into memory, legend, and stone alike. Over time, the castle became a monument to fear rather than to kingship. Tourists of later centuries would wander its halls, remarking on the echoes of ancient power. But even they, if they paused in the silence, could imagine the terror that once filled every chamber, every corridor, every candlelit banquet. In the end, the stones of the castle held a lesson more enduring than any decree or coin. Vengeance, once made a throne, consumes even the one who wears it. Charles had been born from humiliation, and he had spent his life returning it to the world with interest. His death ended the man, but it could not erase the echoes of his cruelty. The castle, empty now, stood as both warning and memory, a hollow monument to the fate of a king whose crown was forged not from gold, but from fear, hatred, and fire. The reign of Charles the Bad was over, but the shadow he cast would linger for generations.